Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. It seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ.
Let's start by the resurrection, because I didn't really get to touch on that much in my last rebuttal. You mentioned that the earliest gospel doesn't have any resurrection appearances, and as you acknowledged,
yes.
It says in Mark 16, the angels tell the disciples to go and tells the woman to go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So there is a implication that there's going to be appearances. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, which is an earlier account, does mention more appearances than any of the Gospels.
500.
Yeah.
Of course, I've always found that quite strange, the reference by Paul there to the appearance to more than 500. This is, I believe, the only account of such an event happening. I wonder kind of who these 500 are, if they ever thought to write anything down, if there's any other account of 500 people having seen this kind of stuff. We're not sure why it is that Paul knows this is the case. He doesn't give an account of where he got this information. It seems to me at least plausibly something that could be false, right? It's not, in other words, it's not like extremely well established that Jesus did appear to a group of 500 people.
No, I agree with you. That I don't think the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15 is a strong evidential value. It's not a major line of argument for me. I'm just challenging your assertion that there's a developmental trajectory.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, which is fine, of course. You recognise that does exist within the Gospels, the only exception being here one reference by Paul in a letter, which, of course, we've got kind of no actual narration of the appearance. We've just got somebody saying that he's essentially heard that this is something that Jesus had done. Our earliest accounts of an actual narration of Jesus appearing to people don't exist in our earlier sources, except, of course, to the appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus, which would be an example of a group hallucination. But funnily enough, I find this quite interesting, is that it's often said that, well, the disciples couldn't have been essentially hallucinating because of the fact of group appearances. You don't get group hallucinations. But the only early account that we have of a group hallucination, that is the appearance to Paul and his travelling companions, is one in which the companions don't also see the appearance. It's just Paul, which I find quite strange. So I'm dubious of
But
this.
they do have sensory perceptions of the encounter. But be that as it may, I do want to ask about, because coming back to your developmental scenario, Mark, we don't know what he would have gone on to say, because he finishes his account very abruptly. Scholars debate over whether Mark is completely intended to finish there, or whether he actually had an ending that subsequently got lost from verse 9 and following. So we don't really know what Mark would have said. And then Matthew and Luke are written approximately around the same time, and Luke doesn't seem to be literally dependent upon Matthew. So really your only data points are Matthew and Luke and John in terms of your developmental trajectory.
Sure, but of course the lack of the appearance narrative in Mark is part of that trajectory. Of course, this could be explained partly by that trajectory, or perhaps by the fact that he did write it and it got lost, or he just decided not to write it, of course. But I'm just kind of using the evidence that's being presented to me here, which are 4 Gospels, the first of which contains no resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, what might explain the fact that as time goes on, the fancifulness of the stories seems to increase. Indeed, ending in John, the final edition, with the addition of Doubting Thomas, which seems to be a moral lesson against requiring evidence for belief. Of course, after Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus, Jesus says that it's, he now believes, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. He believes because he's seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. So what we get is, the further away we get from the actual events that are being reported, the more fanciful the stories, culminating in a story that has a moral lesson advising people that they shouldn't desire to believe on the basis of evidence. This seems to me strange.
So that's not what John's saying there at all. In fact, in the very same chapter, he goes on to say, John, the author goes on to say that these things are written that you might believe that he is the Christ and thus have life in his name. In terms of what he says in verse 29 to Thomas, he's chiding Thomas for not having believed in sufficient evidence because he had the testimony of the other apostles. He'd been with Jesus throughout his ministry and observed the miracles and so forth.
Of course, John is writing at the end of John why he wrote his gospel, but I'm quoting the words of Jesus, right? So there's kind of a disanalogy here, or a difference here, which is that Jesus is saying, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. It's then John who says, oh, but I decided to write this down so that people will come to believe. That it's kind of two separate sources there.
Sure. So, first of all, I gave an explanation for an interpretation of what I think Jesus is saying. And secondly, Jesus, if you look elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus, are we the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? He says, well, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see, and talks about the miracles that he's been performing. Right? He talks about the sign of Jonah and his resurrection as being evidence for his incarnation and divine identity.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there like a question?
Yeah, so I'm objecting to that particular point that Jesus does seem to affirm approaching this topic evidentially.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. That would be fine. I'd be fine to just kind of drop that point about John, but I'm not really sure if we should.
Okay.
It seems to me that seems to be the most natural reading of Doubting Thomas. You're saying that the story should in fact be interpreted as Jesus basically saying, you have believed because you've seen a lot of evidence. Blessed are those who believe having seen sufficient evidence, or something like this?
Yeah, so Thomas was discontent with having sufficient evidence, that he should have believed on the basis of what he already had. And God doesn't take well to people not believing when they've already got sufficient evidence.
Right, I see. That might be plausible. I'm happy to look into it.
The earliest gospel we have, Mark, ends with no appearances of the risen Jesus, just women told he will be seen in Galilee, and they flee in fear, Mark 16:1-8. The later long ending with appearances, Mark 16:9-20, is a known later addition, not in our earliest manuscripts. Then, as time passes, later Gospels add fuller stories, Matthew and Luke, circa 80 to 90 CE, and finally John circa 90 to 110 CE, which is exactly the kind of legendary growth historians expect. Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15, written in the 50s CE, says Jesus appeared to more than 500, but gives no names, place, or narrative, and no other source reports it. Paul also never met Jesus in life and says he received this tradition, so we can't treat it as checked eyewitness history, 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. Claims that groups don't hallucinate, overlook what psychology shows. Grief and expectancy can produce vivid experiences. Studies find 30 to 60% of bereaved people report seeing or sensing a loved one. Memory conformity then spreads and reshapes stories. Even Acts' accounts of Paul's conversion show his companions didn't share his vision, Acts 9:7, 22:9, which matches an internal, personal experience. John's Doubting Thomas ends with, "Blessed are those who have not seen," John 20:29, and the author says he wrote so readers would believe, John 20:31. That's faith-forward theology, not verifiable history. On balance, the earliest evidence fits developing tradition and visionary experiences, not a confirmed physical resurrection.
I did want to ask you, though, about your low intrinsic probability of miracles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So, can you justify why you come to that conclusion?
I guess the point that I was kind of trying to make there was to say that in the context of this discussion, do you expect a naturalist to take as seriously the hypothesis that a man rose from the dead as he should take the hypothesis that, say, Jesus didn't die or something? Like, in other words, like, I suppose you're not surprised that somebody would not do that, but you're saying that they're being kind of irrational in doing so,
Correct.
because in assuming that something like a miracle would have a lower intrinsic probability.
Exactly. So I'm interested in what your justification is for assigning such an intrinsically low probability to miracles.
Wouldn't you say, like as you said, the fact that this doesn't happen elsewhere would not be a good response, because that's what we'd actually want. This is
that's what
God
we'd expect.
Is trying to do. He's trying to put forward a unique event. Could not the same be said that the reason why the resurrection is a powerful vindication of Jesus' message is because it has a low probability of occurring, and so that makes it miraculous that God did it, right? Like, it seems to me that the intuitive force of saying, isn't it amazing that Jesus rising from the dead, isn't it amazing that happened and this vindicates its message, is because of the fact that we should expect this to be so improbable that if it really did happen, this provides strong evidence. And I also wonder if you think that it would provide the same evidence as any other miracle. That is, I don't know why it is that rising from the dead specifically, except maybe the fact that he predicted it, would be any more of indication of his divinity than his ability to turn water into wine. If there was an instance of him having predicted that he would go on to do that and then did that, this seems equally miraculous. This is I don't see why the resurrection in particular would offer a vindication.
Sure. So for a number. Okay, so I'm trying to formulate a question. So Isaiah 53:10, for example, speaks about the resurrection in the context of messianic prophecy. Jesus himself says that the resurrection will be the vindication of his messianic divine self-claims. And so it's very surprising if God raises Jesus from the dead if he's a false messiah, for example, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. Yeah. I think that answers it quite well, I think.
Would you also be amenable to the argument that you can bring other arguments to bear independently on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, such as some of the arguments I listed briefly, the trilemma, messianic prophecy, the conversion of Paul, etc., that would be relevant to establishing the prior probability in Jesus' case specifically?
I think you could do, but I don't think that it's been very well done. I don't think the examples that you say, like the trilemma, I don't think that's like good evidence of Jesus' divinity, nor do I think the conversion of St. Paul is particularly strong evidence of Jesus' divinity. I wonder, I know there's only kind of a minute left of your time, but what are the specificities about Paul's conversion that you think bear on the divinity of Jesus?
Sure. I'm trying to formulate a question. So it's my question time, so I'm rather than give a statement.
Well, I can ask you
sure.
When it comes to you. Have anything else you want to say now?
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the argument for intelligent design, would you acknowledge that it's not a God of the gaps argument, that is actually a positive argument?
This is something I was going to ask you about. You said that it's not a God of the gaps argument because it's based on what we do know, and I forget exactly how you argued that case. If you could maybe just do it again briefly.
Yeah, so it's basically that there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity.
Right. Yeah. So I would say, for example, imagine somebody like pre-Newton or something, looking at the orbits of the planets and saying, like, I have absolutely no idea how they're up there, why they're spinning in the way that they're spinning. It must be God. Would you say that is a God of the gaps argument? Mm-hmm. But suppose somebody then said to you, this isn't a God of the gaps argument. This is actually based on what I do know, not what I don't know, which is that there's a habitual association between things that we see moving, that don't stop moving, generally have some kind of agent causing them to continue moving. And so I say that the same thing must be true of the orbs moving in the sky. That doesn't seem to not make it a God of the gaps argument. That seems like just a way of kind of dressing it up.
When we ask how probable a miracle is, start with the base rate. Across billions of human deaths, there are no medically verified cases of a person dead for days returning to normal life. That makes the prior tiny. To overcome a tiny prior, you need multiple, independent, detailed sources written close to the event. Instead, we have anonymous Gospels decades later. Mark around 70 CE, Matthew Luke around 80 to 90, John around 90 to 110, and a brief list in Paul without names or locations. Low prior plus weak, late testimony. Low posterior probability. Appeals to prophecy don't fix this. The verses Christians cite aren't clear predictions of a Messiah rising on the third day. Psalm 16:10 is about David not being abandoned to Sheol. Hosea 6:2 speaks of Israel's restoration. Isaiah 53:10-11 concerns the servant's vindication, not an explicit personal resurrection. These are theological readings after the fact, not straightforward forecasts fulfilled by data. Paul's conversion also fits known visionary experiences. Acts gives inconsistent details about what his companions perceived. Acts 9, 7 verses. 22-9, which points to literary shaping, and his companions don't share the vision, consistent with an internal event.
That the naturalist will one day be able to explain and account for DNA replication, then that the theist will ever be able to account for suffering or hiddenness. Indeed, it's usually expected that the theist will never be able to offer such an account. Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. I would add to this suggestion a fourth, which is that the reports themselves were inaccurately put down on into our records. But I think Jonathan more or less addressed that by saying that the gospel writers were fairly scrupulous, and so I think implicitly trying to undermine that example. Now, I admit that some of the hypotheses for explaining what happened on Easter morning are a little bit tenuous. There have been theories that have been suggested and generally rejected by certainly most biblical scholars. For example, the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen. These kinds of things are usually disproved with fairly intuitive points. That is to say, it seems ridiculous to suggest that Jesus didn't die on the cross. The Romans did know how to kill people, after all, and there would have been various other reasons, which I won't go into now for the sake of time, but I'm sure you're familiar with such a response. But you have to understand the context in which this conversation is taking place. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. But doesn't it seem less plausible yet to suggest that a man rose from the dead? To the naturalist, you can understand why this would seem like quite a leap unless you've already assumed theism, making the suggestion that this God might have risen Jesus from the dead more plausible than these other explanations. Thinking about the evidence for the resurrection is a complicated topic, but it seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ. What the end of Mark's gospel does say is that, there's essentially a prediction. That is, we're told by an angel or presumed angel, that Jesus has gone ahead to Galilee, and you should expect to find him there. And this is where the original manuscript of Mark's gospel ends. Matthew, the next earliest gospel, does contain two appearances, one to the women who visited the tomb on the way to tell the disciples, and then a vision in line with the prediction made in Mark. Now, of course, if this was being somehow forged or something, it seems quite strange, or at least plausible, that this addition could have been made using Mark as a source, which everyone agrees that Matthew does. Luke, later still, contains even more appearances, including like the road to Emmaus. And then John's Gospel, even later still, provides more accounts of appearances, including doubting Thomas, and some other famous examples. I find it a little strange, then, that the further away we get from the origin of the source, the more appearances we see. The earliest Gospel contains no resurrection appearances. The second earliest Gospel does contain one group appearance, but it's exactly in line with what was predicted at the end of Mark. Anyway, this seems a little strange to me. Now, I won't suggest that I could confidently say that these Gospels were forged, or that the writers were mistaken, or that somebody was lying, or that something got miscommunicated. All I'll say is that for the naturalist, these conclusions seem a lot more plausible than the idea that a man might have risen from the dead. I think that's all I've got time for, but hopefully we can speak about St. Paul in a later stage. Thank you.
When Christians argue there are only three options, disciples lied, were mistaken, or were right, we can point out a fourth, that the stories themselves changed as they were written down. This happens all the time in history. Legends grow, details get reshaped, and later writers add material. We see that in the Gospels. Mark, our earliest source, ends with no appearances. Decades later, Matthew and Luke expand the story with appearances, and John, our latest source, adds even more dramatic scenes like doubting Thomas. The further from the events, the bigger the claims. And there are contradictions. Matthew places Jesus' appearance in Galilee, while Luke keeps it in Jerusalem. The number of women at the tomb, the number of angels, and what exactly happens at the tomb all change from gospel to gospel. This is what you expect if stories are developing, not if they're carefully preserved eyewitness reports. From a naturalistic view, ordinary errors, embellishments, and visions are far more likely than one man breaking the universal biological rule of death. If another religion today offered the same kind of evidence for a miracle, would Christians believe it? What do you think? Is the resurrection better explained by faith tradition than by history? Comment below. Let's discuss. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more.